This is Plant-Based Briefing, How the Dairy Industry Designs Misleading Studies by Dr. Michael Greger at nutritionfacts.org. And I'm your host, Marian Erickson, and this is the curated content plant-based podcast, where I search the internet and find a variety of articles on topics related to healthy, compassionate, and sustainable living, get permission, and read them to you here in about 10 minutes or less every weekday. And today's post is from Dr. Michael Greger. He's a physician, a New York Times bestselling author, internationally recognized speaker on nutrition, food safety, and public health issues. And he founded nutritionfacts.org as a non-commercial, science-based public service to provide free updates on the latest in nutrition research, because there's so much confusing and conflicting nutritional advice out there, usually presented by people with a financial interest. So Nutrition Facts summarizes the latest peer-reviewed nutrition and health research with no conflicts of interest. There are no ads, no corporate sponsorships, and 100% of all proceeds Dr. Greger has ever received from his books, DVDs, and speaking engagements have always and will always be donated to charity. So now let's get to today's plant-based briefing. How the Dairy Industry Designs Misleading Studies by Dr. Michael Greger at nutritionfacts.org. Observational studies suggesting dairy might not be so bad can be confounded by extraneous factors, such as the fact that people who eat more cheese tend to be of higher socioeconomic class. Fine, but what about this interventional study linked here? A randomized crossover trial which compared a high-fat cheese diet to a high-fat meat diet to a low-fat diet. A high cheese diet, cheese, which is loaded with saturated fat, a high meat diet, meat, which is loaded with saturated fat, versus carbs, a low-fat diet. And people ended up with the same cholesterol levels. Let's see how they did it. Half the study was paid for in part by the dairy industry, and the other half paid for by dairy, and dairy. If you're the dairy industry and you're trying to design a study to show that a high cheese diet doesn't raise cholesterol, how would you go about doing that? Anyone remember the video, Bold Indeed, Beef Lowers Cholesterol? It's one of my favorites. The beef industry was in the same pickle as the cheese industry. Beef has saturated fat, which raises cholesterol, which raises the risk of dying from our number one killer. What's an industry to do? So they designed a study where they added beef and cholesterol went down. How is that possible? Here's the two diets. They added beef and the cholesterol went down. They did this by cutting out so much dairy, poultry, pork, fish, and eggs that the overall saturated fat intake was cut in half. They cut saturated fat levels in half, and the cholesterol levels went down. Well, duh. They could have swapped in Twinkies and said, snack cakes lower your cholesterol, or frosting, or anything. Okay, so now that you know the trick, let's go back to the dairy study. The way to get the same cholesterol levels is to make sure all three diets have the same amount of saturated fat. How are you going to get a high-fat cheese diet and a high-fat meat diet to have the same saturated fat level as a diet with neither? Unless, wait, don't tell me. What? They added coconut oil or something to the other diet? They added so much coconut oil and cookies to the so-called low-fat diet that they all had the same amount of saturated fat, and voila! That's how you can make a cheese or meat-rich diet that doesn't raise cholesterol. That reminds me of the desperation evident in the study that compared the effects of dairy cheddar cheese to a non-dairy cheddar cheese called Daiya. Milk consumption has plummeted in recent years as people have discovered plant-based alternatives like soy milk and almond milk. And now there's plant-based cheese alternatives. What's the National Dairy Council to do? How are you going to design a study that shows it's healthier to eat cheese? Design a study where cheese causes less inflammation than the vegan alternative. They got their work cut out for them. Daiya is no health food by any stretch, but definitely 3 times less saturated fat than cow cheese. So I give up. How could you possibly show more inflammation from Daiya? Well, there is one fat that may cause more inflammation than milk fat: palm oil. In fact, it may raise cholesterol levels as much as trans fat-laden partially hydrogenated oil. Yeah, but what are you telling me? They slipped the Dairy group some extra palm oil on the side? Yes, can you believe it? They compared cheese to Dairy plus palm oil. So much extra palm oil that the vegan alternative meal ended up having the same amount of saturated fat as the cheese meal. That's like proving tofu was worse than beef by doing a study where they compared a beef burger to a tofu patty stuffed with lard. Oh, wait, the meat industry already did that. But at least they had the decency to concede that, quote, replacement of meat with tofu in the habitual diet would not usually be accompanied by the addition of butter and lard, unquote. You just listened to How the Dairy Industry Designs Misleading Studies by Dr. Michael Greger at nutritionfacts.org. And I'm your host, Marian Erickson, and I actually laughed out loud when I first read this. So ridiculous, but it's part of sowing the confusion so people don't know what to believe and they throw up their hands and say, well, I might as well just eat what I enjoy. For more information on the way the food industry purposely misleads the public, check out episode 92 called No Purveyor of Unhealthy Products Wants the Public to Know the Truth. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So please share this episode with anyone who might benefit. Please share on your social media. Please send it to a friend. Word of mouth really helps the podcast to grow. And my goal is really to reach as many people as possible with all this great information that's out there. So thanks for sharing and thanks for listening.